Sera pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the corridor wall and listened. 2 floors below, the great hall was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into old buildings after everyone who belongs there has gone to bed. And the sound she had heard was not wind, and it was not the settling of timber, and it was not any of the things she had spent 5 years telling herself the noises of this keep were. It was breathing, low and steady and plural, like a tide coming in from somewhere she could not see. She did not go back to her room. She stood at the wall with her palm against the stone, and her boots unlaced, and her candle burning down toward its last inch, and she waited. The breathing did not stop, it deepened. In the morning she would tell herself she had imagined it. She was good at that, not lying exactly, but the practical reclassification of things that had no place in the ordinary running of her days. She was an omega, and she was a record keeper in the House of Winter, and she had a very small room on the east corridor, with a window that faced the inner courtyard, and what she did not have was any reason to stand at a stone wall at 3 in the morning cataloguing sounds that did not belong to her to hear. She lifted her palm from the wall. The breathing shifted, all of it together, like a single creature orienting, and she felt the fine hairs on her forearm lift under her sleeve, and she felt the cold of the corridor sharpen from discomfort into something else, something that moved through her chest and settled low and specific, not fear, not quite, but the body's older knowledge of being perceived. She went back to her room. She latched the door. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark, for a long time, candle spent, and she did not sleep. She did not know then what she had heard. She would not know for 3 more weeks, when the things she had dismissed as imagination became impossible to dismiss, because they were there in the doorway when she opened it, and they were not small, and they were not alone. And they had been waiting. The keep had not seen the Alpha King's wolves sleep inside its walls in 230 years. There were records of this. She had read them. She had read everything in the archive. In the 5 years she had spent in the wing, no one else wanted to maintain. In the long cold mornings before anyone else arrived, and the long cold evenings after everyone else had left. The wolves, the records noted, had withdrawn from the inner keep during the reign of Aldrich II, and had not returned. No reason was given. It was simply noted, in the dry hand of whatever record-keeper had been serving at the time, as a fact. The wolves had withdrawn, and then nothing, until now, until her door. She stood in the doorway of her small east corridor room, with her unlaced boots and her ink-stained wrists, and the thin morning light beginning at the window behind her, and she looked at the 3 great wolves filling the hall outside her door, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent years being invisible, that something had changed. She did not know what. She was not ready to know what, but she was careful, and she was patient, and she had spent 5 years reading the records of things that had no explanation, and she knew that the first and most important thing to do was not to run, and not to speak, and simply to remain exactly where she was, and to let the morning tell her what it knew. She remained. The wolves did not move. The light came in, and somewhere in the walls of the keep, 2 floors below, in rooms she had never entered and would not have been welcomed in if she had tried, the Alpha King of Winter slept, and did not yet know what his wolves had done. Sera had come to the House of Winter on a grey morning in her 22nd year, with a letter of recommendation from a retired archivist and a canvas pack that held 2 changes of clothing, a set of her own transcription tools, and a book she had read 4 times already and could not leave behind. She had been hired, in the way that things in large institutions are often arranged, without ceremony, without anyone's particular enthusiasm, to assist in the maintenance of the Eastern Archive, which was to say, to do the work no one else was doing, in the part of the building no one else was willing to occupy in winter. The Eastern Archive ran cold from October through March. The windows on that corridor faced away from the sun for most of the day, and the fireplace in the main reading room required a specific manipulation of the damper that none of the senior archivists had the patience to perform and none of the junior staff had been told about. Serapha had figured it out in her first week. She had not told anyone. She had simply made the firework and kept the records in good order, and done her job in a corridor that no one visited, and been, in the way that very competent people in very overlooked positions often are, completely invisible. She was not unhappy. That was the thing she had noticed about herself in those 5 years. She had never been a person who required much by way of acknowledgement. What she required was work she could do well, enough warmth to keep her hands from stiffening, and the particular deep quiet of an archive at night when the building was hers alone, and the records lay open before her, and to move moved at a pace she could follow. She had that. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal more than she had been given in the house she had grown up in, where her designation had been treated as a minor embarrassment, and her competence had been treated as something vaguely suspect, as though the ability to do a thing well was, in an omega, somehow a misrepresentation. The House of Winter was not kind, precisely, but it was large, and in large institutions there are always corners, and corners do not require you to justify your presence. The Eastern Archive was her corner. She had arranged it to her purposes over 5 years. The good light from the inner court window in the mornings, the stack of cataloging ledgers she had reorganized by date rather than by the arbitrary system that had preceded her, the small iron hook by the door where she hung her coat so it would carry some warmth from the room before she put it on. She was paid at the bottom of the scale. She knew this. It was not a source of bitterness. It was simply a fact, accurate in the way that the angular crack along the east wall's third stone was accurate, and the way the archive's catalogue had been missing its 3rd volume since before she arrived was accurate. Things had their conditions, and you noted them, and you worked around them, and you did not spend energy being surprised. Her boots had a split at the left heel that she had repaired twice with a curved needle and waxed thread. She had not replaced them. There was no reason to replace something still doing its job. The other archivists knew her by function more than name. She was the one who found things. If a record had been misfiled or a reference was missing or a date could not be confirmed, someone would, eventually, with minimal directness, leave the problem on the corner of her table, and she would solve it, and the solution would be taken back and used, and the person who used it would not always remember where it had come from. She had made her peace with this. It was the nature of corners. What she had not made her peace with, because she had not yet needed to, was the sensation of being looked for, not looked at. She understood, dryly and without complaint, what it was to be looked at and found unremarkable, but looked for, the experience of a thing or a person, or 3 enormous wolves pressing their warm weight against the boards of her corridor door, orienting toward her as though her location in the building was something they had always known. That had not happened before, and she did not yet understand what it meant. But she was 37 pages into the archive's oldest holdings, cross-referencing a notation she had found about the wolves' withdrawal 230 years ago, and she was beginning to suspect that the explanation was somewhere in those pages, in the dry, careful hand of whoever had been standing in her position then, noting impossible things in the plain language of the factual record. She was not afraid of what she might find. She had been doing this job long enough to know that the truth, whatever it was preferable to the alternatives. It always was. You simply had to be willing to sit with it once it arrived. She pulled the next page toward her, and the morning light moved through the window, and somewhere in the keep, distant and unaware, the king's wolves were already walking the corridor that led to her door. 3 days after she had first heard the breathing in the walls, Sera found the notation. It was on the 14th page of a holdings volume, dated 231 years prior, and the hand that had written it was tight and precise. and gave no indication of the significance of what it was recording, which told her the person writing it had understood that the only way to record something thus impossible in an official document was to treat it as ordinary. The notation read, "The wolves returned twice more to the east corridor before dawn. The matter has not been raised with the king. It is noted here for completeness." Below it, in the same hand, a single additional line. "They did not go to the king's suite. They went to hers." Sera sat for a moment with the page under her hands. The archive was cold that morning, even with the fire she had coaxed into being an hour before she arrived, and her breath came in thin, visible traces that dissolved before they reached the page, and the light was still the flat gray of early morning in a building that had not yet decided to wake. She sat with the page, and she was careful, and she was precise, and she thought very plainly and directly about what the notation meant. 231 years ago, the wolves of the Alpha King of Winter had gone to an Omega's room in the East Corridor. The record keeper had noted it without explanation, and some time after that notation, the volume had a gap, 4 pages that had been carefully removed, not torn, cut, with the patience of someone who had time and intention. The wolves had withdrawn from the keep entirely. For 230 years, she turned back to the gap. She ran her thumb along the cut edges, clean, very old, done with a narrow blade. The pages could have been removed by anyone, at any point in 2 centuries. She would have no way of knowing who. She noted the gap in her own working ledger, in her own tight, careful hand, and she noted the date range and the location of the cut, and she moved on, because that was how you worked through a problem you could not yet solve. You noted what was absent, and you held it alongside what was present, and you let the distance between them tell you its shape. What she did not do was tell anyone what she had found, not because she was hiding it, she was never in the habit of hiding things, but because there was nothing yet worth telling. A notation and a gap were not a conclusion. They were a beginning. She did not know, on that morning, that the beginning had already been observed. That on the morning 2 days prior, when she had stood in her doorway with the light behind her and the 3 wolves in the corridor, she had been watched from the far end of the hall by a figure she had not seen, standing very still in the shadow of the stairwell, who had seen everything she had done, her stillness, her patience, the way she had not run and not spoken, and had simply remained. She did not know that the figure had stood there for a long time after she went back inside. She did not know what it had cost him to remain where he was. She did not know any of it. She went back to her pages. The wolves did not come that night. But the night after, they were there again, and this time when she opened her door, she did not merely stand in it. She crouched down to the boards and held out her hand, palm flat, not reaching, simply present, and the largest of the 3 lowered its head and breathed against her wrist, one long, slow exhale that carried warmth into her cold fingers and did not pull away. She stayed like that for several minutes. Her knees ached. The corridor was dark and cold and very still. The wolf's breath moved against her wrist, like something she did not have a word for yet, something that was not comfort, exactly, and not warmth, exactly, but the bodily knowledge of proximity, of a thing that knew where she was, and had come to where she was, and was telling her, in the only language available to it, that this was not accidental. She noted it in her ledger when she went back inside. Plain language, factual record. She was 32 years old, and she had been doing this job for 5 years, and she was the best record keeper in the House of Winter, and no one knew that, and for the first time in 5 years she thought, someone should. By the 6th morning, the wolves had established a pattern. They arrived before dawn, before the rest of the keep had stirred, and they were gone by the time the first of the household staff came up the east corridor for the morning round. Sera had timed it. She had also begun, without fully acknowledging what she was doing, to wake an hour earlier, so that she was already sitting at her door, with her back against the frame and her hands in her lap when they came. It was on the 6th morning, when she was sitting like that, with the largest wolf's head across her knee, and the grey light just beginning at the corridor window, that she heard the footfall on the stair. It was a single footfall, immediately controlled, the sound of someone who had long practice in moving without an announcement. She raised her head. The man at the far end of the corridor was very still. He was large in the way that old things are large, not excessive but dense, as though the centuries had compressed him into something that took up more of the world than its measurements should suggest. She had seen him twice before in 5 years, both times from a distance, both times in a room full of people, where his attention had been elsewhere, and hers had been on her work. She knew who he was the way anyone in the House of Winter knew who he was. Not as a person she had any occasion to speak to, but as the fact around which the building arranged itself. The Alpha King of Winter looked at her. She looked back at him. She did not move, partly because the wolf's head was still across her knee, and partly because she had made a decision, somewhere in the 6 mornings of sitting at her door, that she was not going to perform a particular version of herself for anyone. She was an Omega who kept records in the East Wing, and the king's wolves had come to her door, and she had let them, and she was sitting on the cold floor with one of them asleep across her lap. And that was simply the fact of the situation, and she was not going to apologize for it. He did not speak. Neither did she. He looked at the wolves, and then he looked at her, and then he looked at the wolves again, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was older than surprise, and harder, and was something she would not be able to name until much later. The look of a man confronting something he had both dreaded and, in some part of himself, he had spent a very long time not examining, wanted. He turned and went back the way he had come. She stayed until the wolves left, and then she went inside and wrote it all down. He came again on the 9th morning, and this time he did not stand at the far end of the corridor. He walked the length of it with the same measured, controlled step, and stopped 3 feet from her door, and she was already seated with the wolves arranged around her as they had been, and she looked up at him, and the morning light from the corridor window was behind him, and she thought, with the precise and unsentimental part of her brain that was always running, "He is counting them. He is counting how many nights they have come." He said, "How long has this been happening?" 6 mornings, she said. "Before that, I heard them twice in the walls. I noted the dates." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite skepticism and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between them. "You noted them. I note things," she said. "It is my job. You're a record keeper." "Eastern Archive." "Yes." He looked at the wolves again. The largest had moved its head from her knee when he arrived, and now sat at an angle between the two of them, easy and settled, as though it had arranged itself there on purpose. Perhaps it had. "They haven't done this," he said, "in a long time. 230 years, she said. "There's a notation in the volume from that period. 4th section, 14th page. I can pull it for you if you want to read it." The look he gave her then was the first one that felt, to her, entirely unguarded. It lasted only a moment. Then the control came back, not coldly, but as something habitual, a thing done so long it had become structural. And he looked away from her and toward the window and back again. "What does the notation say? That the wolves went to an Omega's room in the east corridor, that the record keeper noted it for completeness without raising it with the king." She paused. "There are 4 pages missing after that notation. They were cut, not torn. I can't tell you when." He was quiet for a moment. The corridor was very still. She felt the warmth of the wolves around her, their slow, steady breathing, the weight of the large one's flank against her side, and she felt, with a physical specificity that surprised her, the warmth at the side of her neck, at the place where her shoulder met her throat, pulsing in a rhythm she had first noticed 3 mornings ago and had not yet written down. She had not written it down because she did not know what to call it. She was good at naming things, but this she did not yet have a word for. "What is your name?" he asked. Sera, she said. He said nothing more. He looked at her for another moment, and then he turned and walked back down the corridor. And the wolves stayed, and she watched him go, and she thought, he already knows about the notation. He knows about the pages that were cut. He has been waiting to see if I would find it, or he has been waiting to see what I would do with it once I did. She thought, I have no idea which. She thought, I am going to find out. The threat, when it came, arrived in the form of paper. This was how it usually worked, in Sera's experience. Not with raised voices or visible confrontation, but with a very formal document delivered by a functionary who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable about what they were carrying. The document, set on the corner of her work table in the East Archive on a grey Thursday morning, while she was in the back section pulling the volume she had promised to the king, bore the seal of the House Comptroller and informed her, in the polite and precise language of institutional power, that her position in the Eastern Archive was under review due to a complaint regarding her use of restricted holdings without documented authorization. She stood in the middle of her archive with the document in her hands, and she read it twice. The second time, she read it for what it actually said, rather than what it appeared to say, which was the habit of a person who had spent 5 years reading documents that contained information both stated and unstated. What it appeared to say was procedural review, authorization, restricted materials. What it actually said was, you have been noticed, and by someone who would prefer you had not been. She set the document on her table. She went to the back section and retrieved the volume she had been looking for, and she brought it to her table, and she sat down, and she opened her working ledger, and she began to compile her answer. Not an argument, not a complaint, a record. She had authorization for every document she had touched. She knew this because she was meticulous, and because she had been doing this work in a wing no one supervised closely enough to require meticulous tracking, and because the habit of logging each access had been hers from the first week, an instinct born not from any policy, but from the understanding that invisible people who do important work must keep their own accounting. No one else was going to do it for them. She pulled her access log from the bottom drawer, 5 years of entries, each dated, each listing the holding accessed, the purpose noted in brief, the status of the item before and after she handled it. She set it alongside the document from the comptroller. She noted the complaint. She noted its date. She noted that the complaint had arrived 4 days after her first direct conversation with the king in the corridor, and that the document's procedural language referenced no specific unauthorized access, only a general claim, which meant either the complaint had been filed before a specific allegation could be constructed, or the allegation was never meant to survive scrutiny. The first was careless, the second was deliberate. She thought, carefully and without heat, about who might file such a complaint. She arrived at a name within a few minutes, not because she had enemies particularly, but because she had recently been given visibility she had never sought, and visibility that belongs to one person is often taken from another, and the person it had been taken from was not a villain, exactly, but was a self-interested one, which was a rather different thing, and which meant they would not enjoy being confronted, but would accept a sufficient accounting if it were offered plainly enough, and with no drama. She did not intend to be dramatic. She spent the next 2 mornings assembling the accounting, and when it was done she carried it, along with a formal written response to the comptroller, to the administrative offices at the far end of the keep. She handed both to the functionary at the front desk. She said, I believe these address the complaint fully. If there are questions, I'm available. The functionary took the documents with the expression of someone who had received more than they expected and was not quite sure what to do with the excess. She went back to the archive. She made the firework. She pulled her chair to the window, and she sat with the 14th page of the old Holdings volume and the afternoon light falling across the cut edges of what was missing, and she thought about what the notation had said. They went to hers. 231 years ago, someone had been sitting where she was sitting. Not the same chair, not the same room, but the same corner of the same wing of the same keep. An Omega, unspecified, unnamed, keeping records, and the wolves had come to her door, and someone had cut the pages that would have told what happened next, and the wolves had withdrawn from the keep for 230 years. She thought, I would like to know her name. She thought, I would like to know what she chose. The comptroller's office sent a response on the fourth day. The complaint, the response indicated, had been reviewed and found to be without sufficient basis for formal proceeding. The matter was closed. The name of the filing party was not stated. She had not expected it to be. She filed the comptroller's response in her working ledger under the date, and made a note of the outcome in her smallest, plainest hand, and she did not allow her satisfaction beyond the quiet and specific kind that comes from having done what you set out to do, cleanly and completely, without anyone having to raise their voice. She had expected that to be the end of it, at least for a time. What she had not expected was the knock at her archive door that afternoon. A quiet knock, a single measured sound, and the king in her doorway when she called enter, ducking his head slightly for the frame, as though this were a thing he had done before. He looked at the room. She watched him take in the reorganized ledgers, the fire she had coaxed into genuine warmth, the working table with its ordered stacks, and the lamp angled exactly right for close reading. He looked at these things the way people look at evidence of a life, not cataloging it but reading it. The complaint has been dismissed, he said. I know, she said. You submitted a 5-year access log. I keep records, she said. I told you. It is my job. He came further into the room, which was small enough that his presence reorganized the available air. He stopped at the table and looked at the holdings volume still open to the 14th page and the cut edges of what was missing, and he was quiet for a moment. You know what they are, he said. It was not a question. I know what the record says they are, she said. I know what my body has been saying they are for 2 weeks, which is a different kind of knowing, and I haven't decided what to do with it yet. He looked at her then, a long, steady look, and she held it without flinching, as she had learned to hold most things. The pages that were cut, he said, recorded a bond that was denied. The Omega left the keep. The record of her was removed by my predecessor's counsel. The wolves withdrew because the bond was not completed, and a broken bond does not resolve, it calcifies. He paused. I have been managing that inheritance for 230 years. Sera was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. The room was very warm. And now your wolves are sleeping in my doorway, she said. Yes, because you think I am. Because you are, he said. There is no think. I have known since the first morning I stood at the end of the corridor. I came back because I needed to understand what you would do with it. He looked at the open volume, the cut edges, the record of the thing that had been removed. Now I do. She folded her hands on the table. She was very still. The warmth at her neck, at the mark site, was present and specific, and had been for 2 weeks, and she was done pretending she could not feel it. The Omega who left, she said, she had a choice. She did, he said. She made it because no one told her plainly what she was, or what it meant, or that the bond was already carrying both of them, whether she completed it or not. His jaw moved. That was not cruelty. It was cowardice. I intend to do it differently. She looked at him for a long moment. Tell me plainly, then. You are my fated mate, he said. The bond has been active since before your first morning in this keep. In the way that bonds sometimes predate the meeting. It draws people to the same place, the same building, the same corner. You have been here 5 years. I have let myself not look at why. I am telling you now because you are owed the information, and because you keep records, and you should have the accurate one. He paused. I am not asking because the bond requires it. I am asking because I am choosing to ask. Because you are the person who sat on a cold corridor floor for 6 mornings and held out your hand without flinching, and who found the notation in 2 days that I have been watching the archive for decades, and who answered a bad faith institutional complaint by producing 5 years of meticulous accounting without a single raised voice. She listened to all of this without moving. I would like you to stay, he said. Not here in this room, in the keep, as mine if you will have me. Take whatever time you need to decide. I don't need time, she said. I've been deciding for 2 weeks. I was waiting to see if you would say it plainly. He looked at her. And? You said it plainly, she said. Yes. There was no ceremony in the decision. There was simply the two of them in the warm archive room, with the fire burning and the Holdings volume open to its missing pages, and the wolves asleep somewhere in the keep below, and the ordinary afternoon continuing on the other side of the window. She had expected to feel something large, something that matched the scale of what had just been agreed to. What she felt instead was something quieter, the specific and profound relief of a weight she had been carrying. For so long she had stopped noticing it lifting, not with drama, but simply and completely. The way light enters a room when someone opens a shutter they have not opened in a very long time. He stayed another hour. They talked about the notation and the missing pages and the 230 years, and she told him about the cut edges and the date range and the things she had noticed about the filing party's handwriting on the comptroller's complaint, and he listened to all of it with the complete and focused attention of a person for whom very little is actually worth attending to, and she understood, watching him listen, that this too was a form of being chosen. He left when the afternoon light was going. At the door he paused. Don't go anywhere, he said. I work in the East Archive, she said. I haven't gone anywhere in 5 years. He made a sound that was not quite a smile, and not quite not one. Then he was gone. After that, she sat for a while in the quiet of the archive. She looked at the open volume, the cut edges, the record of the woman who had not stayed, and she said, in the direction of the old page, in the plain voice she used for all accurate things, I know your name now. I found it in the secondary ledger from the same period. You were called Marin, and I think you were very afraid. I think I would have been too. She closed the volume. She put it back in its place on the shelf. She opened her working ledger and made the final entry for the day in her smallest, most careful hand, and the entry said only, Bond acknowledged, offer made and accepted, the rest as always to follow. She put her coat on. It was warm from the hook by the door, and she felt the warmth settle onto her shoulders like a thing deliberately placed there. And she went down to supper, for the first time in 5 years, without the particular intention of going unnoticed. The weeks that followed did not look, from the outside, like a transformation. She still worked in the Eastern Archive. She still made the fire work each morning, by the manipulation of the damper no one else had figured out. She still arrived before anyone else, and stayed later, and she still found things that had been misfiled and corrected records that were wrong, and the split at the heel of her left boot was still there, neatly repaired for a third time now, because there was no reason to replace something still doing its job. What changed was harder to describe and easier to see. The people in the corridor stepped aside for her with a speed that was not quite deference, and not quite anything else she had a word for yet, their eyes moving away, the way eyes move when they understand, without being told, that something in the room outranks them. She noticed this without comment. She filed it as a fact. The wolves slept in the east corridor now every night, and the keep had quietly reorganized itself around this, as large institutions reorganize around facts, once those facts have been established long enough to become structural. The king found her in the archive each morning before the house woke. Not for long, 15 minutes, sometimes 20. He brought the kind of information he kept for himself, things about the keep's history, the bond's history, the names of the people who had shaped both. She brought him the records she had found. It was not romantic exactly, in the way that people mean when they say that word. It was better than that. It was the experience of being entirely known by someone who had chosen, deliberately and at some cost to himself, to know her. Spring came into the keep the way it always came, not suddenly, but by increments, the light returning an inch at a time, the frost retreating from the inner courtyard stones, the wolves beginning to sleep in the great hall instead of the corridor, which was simply a matter of warmth, and she did not take it personally. The formal recognition before the pack happened on a morning in early spring, without announcement. She stood in the great hall in her ordinary clothes, the boots, the ink-stained wrists, the coat that fit well enough. And the wolves were there, and the household was there, and the king stood beside her, not in front of her, and the room went very still in the particular way she had come to understand, other wolves registering a fact through their bodies before their minds had caught up. The Omega from the East Archive, with her worn boots and her meticulous ledgers and her 5 years of invisibility, standing at the Alpha King's side as the room's instincts reorganized her status without a single word being spoken. There was a woman near the back, one of the senior household staff, a woman who had walked past Sera for 4 years without acknowledging her existence, who stepped aside when Sera left the hall and held the door and looked at the floor. Sera thanked her without irony and meant it. The woman looked up, briefly startled. Sera kept walking. It was not a triumph. It was not the outcome of a long battle. It was simply the morning, in the keep that had been hers in practice for 5 years, and was now hers in fact. And the wolves were settled in the hall, and the archive was waiting with its warm fire, and its ordered records, and the gaps she had not yet found answers to, and the king was somewhere in the building, knowing exactly where she was. Not because the bond told him, though it did, because he had chosen to know. She walked back to the East Archive. She hung her coat on the hook by the door. She opened her ledger to the current page, and she wrote the date, and she began. It was not remarkable. It was simply the morning, and the morning was hers, and it was everything. Would you have sat on that cold corridor floor and held out your hand, not knowing what you were reaching toward? Let me know in the comments below.